Welcome to the Remote No Pressure Podcast. We're super excited. We saw the numbers from last month and it's been crazy. We've experienced some crazy growth. Thank you so much. And if you're new here, we're super excited that you're here with us in this journey to just kind of make sense of life through the medium of fly fishing. This week's episode is no exception. We have Mr. Joel Follette from the Royal Treatment Fly Shop. This sixth generation Oregonian just tells us about life and how he got in the business. And what's so awesome is the romantic story he tells about how his fly shop got the name. It's straight up Hemingway. Welcome to the podcast. Let's light the fire. Today on the Remote No Pressure Podcast, we have Joel Follette here with us. Thank you very much for joining us, Joel.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff, for having me.
Yeah, can you just tell our audience a little bit about what you're doing as far as your professional life? And you also have a fantastic newsletter that goes out that I've been reading a few of the back issues. They were great. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Well, now I find myself basically a fly shop owner out here in West Linn, Oregon, which is a suburb of Portland, Oregon. I've lived here I'm born and raised in Oregon. I'm a sixth generation Oregonian. And I've had a varied career that brought me to this point. If you would have asked me, we'll just go back to say 30 years ago, if I was going to be a fly shop owner, I looked at you and said, you're crazy. But I've always fly fished. I mean, I've been fly fishing for 53 years. And I grew up with a fly rod in my hand. And my original fly rod, which is an old bamboo Bristol, hangs above the door in my fly shop right now. So it's a tradition for me, and it's something that I've been passionate about most of my life. And now I find myself, firmly making a living in that particular industry. So.
Well, that's great, Joel. So your fly shop there, you said that you never really thought you would become a fly shop owner, but how did that ultimately happen? What was the journey like, and what was the journey?
Well, I was raised. My mom passed away when I was young, and we ended up living with my grandparents for a short period of time. And my grandfather was a fly fisherman and a fly tyer. And he wasn't used to having kids around the house at that age. So I learned quite quickly that I was allowed to go down after the evening meal and watch him tie flies as long as I kept my mouth shut. And so I would sit there and I would read the stacks of Field and Streams and Outdoor Lives, and I'd watch him tie flies. And after a few weeks of watching, he turned to me one day and asked if I would like to try that. And I tied what we call a bucktail coachman out here, from start to finish without any instruction, because I'd been watching him for weeks. And so I knew how to pick the materials and stack the wing and do all the stuff. And from that day forward, I was really into fly fishing. And I would tag along with my dad and my grandfather to the Deschutes. And the first time a rod was actually put in my head was on the Metolius River, which is a spring creek here in Oregon. And it's a little cliche, but I was hooked. And I've always had a connection to fly fishing. And eventually, I also kind of got into adventure a little bit. And so when I got out of high school, I took off and I worked on the ocean here on the Pacific Ocean for several years, with my main goal to return to the city at some time and become a commercial photographer, which I did in 81. And that career carried me until I kind of got interested in motor racing and kind of left photography, got into racing sports cars and managing a racing school. And when that kind of wound down and that bug kind of went away, I found myself in between projects and had a pretty good severance package, and I decided I was going to do something fun. And I wandered into a little Orbis shop here in the area, and offered to tie flies at the sportsman show if they'd get me a pass into the sportsman show so that I could attract some folks to their booth. And next thing you know, I'm working part-time there and helping them out. Next thing you know, I'm managing it. And one thing led to another, and I was moved on to another shop, hired me away. And about 7 years ago, again, found myself with nothing better to do, and I was going to get back into photography. And my friends and customers from 12 years of being in the industry really encouraged me to open my own store, and so that's what we did.
Wow. Now, you had mentioned before we started recording that you were a professional photographer, and you use that quite a bit for your website and different things like that. And we also have a huge following on Instagram. And you know, there's all this fish porn going on. There's a lot of crazy stuff. But let me ask you this question. I mean, in your opinion, what makes a great picture, in your professional opinion, when it comes to fishing and outdoor life? I mean, what makes a great picture, and how do you think some of our listeners could capture that, say, on their iPhones, or is that even possible?
Oh, you know, the iPhone, I carry one with me everywhere, and I also carry, you know, probably $20,000 worth of camera equipment. But the iPhone is handy, and you know, when somebody asks me what camera they should use, and you should use the camera that you have in your hands, because that's the one that you are going to capture the image that you see right now. And it's great to have the time to go and set up a shot in the Alivor Desert, you know, for an advertising campaign, but and wait for the sweet light. But when you're out fishing and you're out, you know, traipsing around in the outdoors, you know, a lot of times you don't want to carry a heavy camera because you're carrying fishing gear or whatever. And I have several different things I carry with me, but yeah, the current iPhone is incredible as far as photography. But if I was going to give anyone photography advice, I would say really look at how you're interpreting the subject, and try not to. I mean, the basic rules of composition and lighting and all those things. I mean, that's something that you can learn. You know, I learned it years ago by looking at the works of some of the masters of the day. But it's also, I mean, there's basic fundamentals, and you know, don't put things dead center, and try not to have the horizon dead center, and you know, divide your images into thirds. I mean, there's all sorts of little tricks. But number one is just get the shot. And when it comes to fish photography, you know, we all have all these great hero shots of fish that we've captured over the years. And I don't know, maybe my career's got to the point where that's not as important as it once was. And I'm fully supportive of the keep them wet theory, especially out here in the West, where we're dealing with anadromous fish and wild native fish that studies have shown suffer, you know, being exposed to air for even short periods of time. And so I'm really intrigued with the photography that I see where the fish is in its natural environment. You have to remember, when you photograph a fish out of the water, that instant is captured and preserved forever. And so that fish is forever out of water. And we all know that it was a quick movement to lift the fish up for the photograph and then back into the water. But that fish is forever out of water, and is recorded that way. And so I personally, in my newsletter, have tried to avoid, you know, people will send me images to use for articles that about, you know, a presentation they're giving or whatever. I purposefully try to avoid images where fish are photographed out of water. I have a little leeway when it comes to non-native species, you know, especially invasive species here in the West. I'll make an exception. But for the most part, when we're talking about wild and native species, I would prefer to have those photographed in the water. And so we're doing a lot of hashtag keep 'em wet stuff, and I think that's an important thing, and I think it's a responsibility that we fly fishermen need to really kind of take a serious look at, because after all, we are the advocates for our fisheries, and we need to make sure that when we pass on good practices to up and coming anglers, that not to take away from anyone that is new to the sport and wants a picture of their beautiful brown trout. But I think if we start setting an example of how we can photograph those things in more naturally, I think that's important.
Were you always this passionate about keeping them wet, or what? How did you come to this conclusion?
Well, I think more recently studies have come out where even short exposure to air, especially with our anadromous fish, the steelhead and salmon, reduces their chance of survival when released. And out here in the West, we're dealing with some wild populations that are endangered. And when you increase the mortality, even a single percentage point, it can be a serious consequence to the overall population. So I would have to say it's been in more recent years. I think we've become more aware of that. But I think I think it's something that it's not necessarily brand spanking new, but it's relatively new, and I think it's just due to some of the studies that have been done.
That's great, and we talk a lot about fly fishing being multi-generational, or introducing people to fly fishing, because one of our goals here our mission is to tell the world about the joy and healing powers of fly fishing. That's our mission statement. So a lot of people that listen may be taking someone out and introducing someone else to the sport of fly fishing, or maybe they came across our podcast and decided to try it out. Because I do get emails like that from time to time. Responsibility of the person who's introducing someone else to fly fishing, that's a huge responsibility, because it seems like the first time you're exposed to that, whoever's exposing you to fly fishing, those are kind of the habits that you adopt. Would you agree to that?
Yeah, I would, and I think that the thing too you have to remember is that in the history of fly fishing, catch and release fly fishing is really relatively new. I mean, we started back in the 60s here on the Deschutes. We started seeing signs that the local groups started posting that was limit your catch, don't catch your limit. And you have to understand, out here in the West in the 1800s and early 1900s, the limit on trout was 175 fish.
Wow.
And when we got into the 1915, 1920, the population screamed when the limit was lowered down to 75 fish a day, over 5 inches in length. And it doesn't take rocket scientists to figure out that that's probably not a really good way to keep your resource healthy. And I think that, obviously things change with time. I think we have to, as anglers, we need to adapt to, obviously increasing population, the loss of habitat, and the strain on our fisheries. If we want to keep doing this sport and we want it to be available for our children and our children's children, we need to be more, I think we need to advocate more for our resources, and we also need to work to protect and preserve them. So.
Yeah, those are all great points, and hopefully someone who's listening, hopefully can catch that spirit and that vibe, of exactly what you're saying. I mean, it's different all over the country depending on where you're from, but definitely. The catch and release, and also, keeping them wet. It's important no matter where you're at.
Well, the thing you have to understand too, in the part of the country where you're at, for instance, you have salmon and steelhead populations that originated here on the West Coast,
Mm-hmm.
And they weren't native to your area, and they were not, they're not necessarily what we would consider wild native fish in your area, but they're nevertheless a very popular fishery, and they provide, sports, and they're important to your local economy. Um, Here in the West, and I would assume so on the East Coast too, with Atlantic salmon and the different species on the East Coast. Here on the West Coast, we still have remnant populations of wild native fish, and they're hanging on by their fins.
Wow.
And so we have to really be conscious about how we handle those fish when we do encounter them, and you would find too, and there's a difference between wild fish out here and hatchery fish. I know, fishing the Deschutes. A lot of times, when you hook a steelhead, there's a lot of times when you can tell right from the very hook set that you've attached yourself to a wild fish or you've attached yourself to a hatchery fish. And so we do have streams that have mixed populations, and that causes other issues. But those wild fish are important to the overall population, whether it's hatchery or wild, because without wild fish, you do not have a hatchery resource. So.
Yeah, those are all great points. You had mentioned as fly anglers we should be adaptive, and like when the studies come out, be willing to change and be flexible. Now, Joel, you own a retail fly shop, and you got a great online shop as well, and we'll have links to your site on our in our show notes as well, so people can check it out. But being flexible, do you think that's one of the reasons why you're still open? I mean, now the trends of retail have changed a lot, and we've talked to some, quite a few fly shop owners on here. Do you think being flexible is one of the reasons you've been so successful at your business?
Well, I'll have to tell you that I did a little trip this weekend down to Southern Oregon, and in preparation for your phone call today, I listened. I power listened to all your podcasts. It's a long drive down to the Rogue River, and so I listened to them, and I listened to some of the other shop owners, and I would have to say that each part of the country is going to have a different take on how retail works in their particular area. And a lot of it has to do with whether you're a destination shop on the banks of the Missouri River in Craig, Montana, or you're a shop like mine in a major metropolitan area that as itself is a destination. I mean, people don't come to my shop necessarily because there's a river next door, although there is. They come to my shop because they're there for something in particular. And my shop is a little different than, say, a shop in Craig, Montana, or Craig on the East Coast, in that I've built my shop and its success on the same basic principles of the old shops that I used to visit as a kid. The shops that you'd go into, and there would be a guy tying flies, and you'd sit down. There's a table, there's a pot of coffee, and things like that. And one of the comments I heard earlier in one of your podcasts is, that those things have gone away. Well, they haven't. They're alive and well in Westland, Oregon right now. Our shop has I build my shop on brick and mortar. Yes, we have a web presence, but I do almost all of my business through my front door. Wow. And we've built a community here. And I think any business, whether it's a fly business or a bicycle business or whatever, what you want to do is you want to be important enough to your clientele that they are invested in your business. It is in their best interest that you are successful. And what we've tried to do with Royal Treatment Fly Fishing is to make it a place that is welcoming. It's a place that you can come no matter what questions you have to ask. There are no silly questions. There are no dumb questions. We're here for you, whether you're in for a single spool of tippet, or a brand new Winston rod, and we'll answer your questions. And I was talking with a customer of mine who has been a customer of mine for, probably 18 years. And he commented that the first time he came to see me, he came in and it's like, I think I need a new fly line. And so I took his reel and I looked at it and I said, well, this one looks pretty good. Have you cleaned it? And well, no. And so, I spool it off and clean the line up and get it all set up and put a new butt section on it and say, why don't you go try that? I don't think you need a fly line. And, when you treat customers like you want to be treated and you don't, you're not trying to sell them stuff, you're just trying to help them enjoy the sport. I think it comes back to you tenfold. And I think that's what we've done. I think the secret of our success is that we don't try to sell anything to anybody, but we have a lot of things for people to come and buy if they need it. And we try to help them figure out exactly what they need to do exactly what they want to do. And we have a lot of fun doing it. And I've got some of the best staff on the planet when it comes to that. I mean, in this industry, you have to, I'm sure you would agree that you can buy pretty much everything I sell just about anywhere. I mean, you can buy it on the internet, you can walk into other shops, you can buy it at big box stores. The stuff is available. So buying stuff is not the hard part. The hard part is finding somebody that will help you buy the right stuff. And having people with experience that have been there, done that, and don't have egos and are just going to bend over backwards to make sure that you have everything you need so you can go out and have fun. That's what this, that's what owning a fly shop's all about. And it is so rewarding when it's working that way. And like I said, we're having a lot of fun out here, and it's really cool to see. We have a lot of events. We have a lot of fly tires. We try to have an event almost every Saturday in the shop. We have a tires table that we set up, and we invite local tires to come in, sit down from about 11 o'clock till 2 o'clock, and tie flies and just share techniques, with the folks that show up. And we never know how many people will show up, but there's usually anywhere from 10 to 30 people that kind of cruise through the shop just to watch the fly tire. And on some Saturdays, we'll have special presentations. We have a small classroom area that will seat about 18 people. And we'll have presentations on, winter steelhead fishing, or, recently we had one on kayak fishing. A gentleman actually brought a kayak into the shop. He had a very nice, we've got a projector, and he had a PowerPoint display on kayak fishing. And we also broadcast it simultaneously to the big screen TV in the rest of the shop, so that there's not a bad seat in the house. You can be out there buying flies and see what's going on in the classroom. So, we try to make it, like I said, part of the community. And there's a group of regulars that roll in, every Saturday at 10 o'clock to see who's tying. And I'll have to tell you that it's really, you may not sell a bunch of stuff while those events are going on or whatever, but when those folks need something, you're their shop, and it's just a lot of fun. It is truly a lot of fun.
When I think about fly shops, what you're describing is exactly what I have romanticized in my head. So I'll have to make a trip out there and check it out.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of ways to do business this day and age, and but I think the personal connection, the relationships, those are long term. You can do the internet sales, or you can do the discounts or whatever, all this other stuff. But if you build long-term relationships with your clientele, you're going to be successful. And I think it's just a great philosophy. I don't care what business you're in. I think if you build long-term relationships and take the time and effort, it's gonna pay for itself. And so I think it's a great way to do it. When I first decided that I was going to open a fly shop, my dad lives here close by, and my dad's like my best friend, and great fishing partner. And went over to his house, and his wife's Sally. When I said, I'm kind of thinking that this is what I need to do, and this is kind of my plan, and this is how I'm going to make it happen. And Sally said, well, I'm going to make cookies every Saturday. And so the first Saturday that we opened, she had 6 dozen homemade cookies at the shop, and people came in and had homemade cookies. And I thought, well, this is cool. This will last a few months. She has made 6 dozen homemade cookies for the shop every Saturday for the last 7 years.
Wow.
And I will tell you, if there's one thing that we've become famous for is the Cookie Lady's homemade cookies. And it's just one of those things. It's it's the Norman Rockwell kind of fly shop atmosphere where you can come in. There's some homemade cookies. There's coffee. If there's a football game on, we've got that on the television. But we've got fly tires in there, and like I said, it's like you said, it's the fly shop I always wanted to go visit.
Mm-hmm.
And back in the mid '90s, I was doing some driver training, like I explained, with the racing school, and I was also doing a program where I went around the country and I trained police officers. And I found myself in New Hampshire, training at the academy in Concord, New Hampshire. And we would train till about 3:00 in the afternoon, and then they were done 2:30 or 3:00. And so I'm, instead of going back to the hotel, you can hit a lot of fly shops, because first of all, New Hampshire and Vermont, they're not very big compared to Oregon. I mean, you can drive across them in an hour. And so I would kind of make the tour, and I stumbled into a fly shop, and I believe it was New Boston. It was Hunter's Fly Shop, and I used to do a catalog back then. And I walked in, and they said, "Hey, how are you? Come on in." And they said, "Can we give you a Coke?" And they brought me a nice cold Coca-Cola, and make yourself at home. And so I kind of poked around in the shop, and they had a big wall of drawers where their tying materials were, and I poking in there, and I found a golden pheasant crest. It was a really unusual color. It was a teal color, and I bought that, and I bought a few other things, and thanked them. And I mean, it was just a cool atmosphere. Well, about 2 weeks later, I was over on the Deschutes. This is October by now, and we're up there chasing steelhead with my dad and some friends. And I sat down at the table with this head that is golden pheasant crest that I bought, and a few other materials. And I sat down and I created a steelhead fly. And we're up there steelhead fishing. It's the end of October. It's a little chilly on the Deschutes, and I tied 2 of these flies. And got up the next morning, and we fish with 2-handed rods a lot, and this was in the early part of that whole transition here in the West. 2-handed rods weren't super popular. The spey rods weren't super popular yet, but I had a 15-foot spey rod and a line that I bought from a gentleman in England, and I went up to one of my favorite runs on the river with these 2 flies that I tied, and I'd put them on in tandem, and was swinging through, and in the first 2 hours of the morning, I landed 2 absolutely stunning wild hen steelhead. Wild, they were jumping, and it was just gorgeous. And the last fish was out fighting and jumping, and just as the sun kind of crested the canyon, and the Deschutes runs a little warmer than the air that time of year, and the steam was just coming up off the river, and this fish is out there jumping, and you can just see these smoke rings of steam as this fish leaves the water and re-enters. and got the fish in and carefully released her. And I'm sitting there on the banks, and it's just a spectacular morning sunrise. And I'm looking at this fly, and it doesn't have a name yet. And I just said to myself, I just got the royal treatment. And so that's what I named the fly. And the fly became, a favorite. And it was tied commercially, and it became a favorite of a lot of my customers when I was working at other places. It was the standard in a lot of boxes. And when it came time to open my shop, it was just a natural that's what we would name the shop. And it went from being a very productive steelhead fly to being a philosophy on a way of doing business.
Wow. I love that story. Do you have a picture of that fly by any chance?
Well, yeah, it's actually our logo is a caricature of the royal treatment, and if you're real nice to me, I'll send you one. How's that?
Well, that's great. I'd love to try it out.
It's tied commercially. We have it custom tied for the shop. We have a really great fly supplier that's out of California. That's a good friend of, and his company does an excellent job in tying those flies. And so, in fact, I have to say that when I used to be able to tell my flies from the commercially tied flies, and nowadays, boy, I can hardly tell the difference. It's making me feel really bad. But what's great is that the fly continues to do well, and it's fun to have something like that has that much history. That fly was first tied. In fact, that fly will be 20 years old this October, and
wow.
So that's a cool bit of history, and it has introduced me to a lot of people. It's made some great friendships. I ran into Tom McGuane, the author, and Tom Brokaw on the Deschutes one day, and I'd been talking with both of them on the phone when I was at this other shop, and they'd purchased some flies, and I actually sent them some of my flies. And I ran into them. I was over on the Deschutes fishing, and they were fishing with another guide over there, and I was chatting with the guide when they rolled up, and introduced myself, and they said, "Oh yeah, you sent us some flies." Like, "Oh yeah, guide." And they had a pretty lousy fishing trip on the Deschutes, but I got a letter from McGuane later, and he had gone up to the Dean and landed a 19-pound steelhead on my fly, and he had sent me a really nice letter to that effect. And so that's always that's a pretty cool thing when somebody gets a really nice fish on one of your flies. I think that's an awesome thing. So.
Yeah, no kidding. That sounds like an amazing story. Tom Brokaw's been brought up a couple times on the podcast. So that's interesting that you bring him up. I would love to interview him. So Tom, if you're out there, give us a call.
Well, I found both those guys to be really just fine gentlemen, and both of them sent me lovely little notes, that I still have in my collection of stuff. But I think fly fishermen in general have a sense of have a sense of history, have a sense of just a different standard. And I'm not saying anything negative about other forms of fishing. I'm just saying that for fly fishing, I mean, we're already getting into the game, and we're a little bit behind the curve as far as success goes. I mean, everybody knows it's probably going to be a lot easier to catch a fish if we skewer a worm or something. But we're doing it for other reasons, and we like a challenge. And I think people that are into the challenge of sport look at life a little differently. And I think that's I can't put one finger on what's the one thing that makes me, want to fly fish, other than I just, it's something I enjoy. Years ago, in the wintertime, we tended to put our fly tackle away in the winter here because you couldn't get a fly down to winter steelhead. And so you'd pick up a drift rod and go after winter steelhead that way. Well, once Jim Teeny started doing his heavy sinking lines, and then we got into spay lines and Skagit lines and sink tips and all that. It opened up a whole world of winter steelhead fishing with a fly. And now out here in the West, we never put our stuff away. We just go from one thing to another, and it's just a matter of changing the heads out and grabbing a different fly box. And so you can literally, here in the Portland metro area, you can catch steelhead virtually every month of the year.
Wow. Sounds great. If you look back on your careers, I mean, you've had a lot of different careers, but it seems like this is where your passion is with your fly shop, and you've been there for a while. What would you say, looking back on your family, on your shop and everything, what would you say has been your most successful accomplishment?
My marriage. I'd have to say, I met my wife, I'm going to say 29 years ago. We'll be married 27 years here this coming April, which is a really important number for us because we both race sports cars, and we both raced before we even knew each other with car number 27.
Wow.
I picked the number because it was the number for Formula One driver Rene Arnoux at the time, who raced for Ferrari, and so 27 was kind of a cool number in my book. I have no idea why she chose 27, but by the time we met each other and fell in love and got married, we had both been racing car number 27, and I actually dropped my car off, my first race car, off at the I was autocrossing before, and I got into road racing, and I dropped my first race car that I built off at the paint shop on a Thursday. We got married on Saturday, picked the car up on Tuesday, and raced the following Saturday, and then drove it on the highways over to my dad's house for the reception the following Saturday. And had it on display, and we both for the reception. We got married at the coast, with the tux and the wedding dress and all that. But at the reception, I had to rent the tux again. But we both wore our racing shoes.
Wow.
So yeah, we have a little racing history between us. But I'd have to say that my biggest accomplishment and the one that I'm most proud of is building a very solid marriage over the last 27 years.
That's great. You have one piece of advice for some of the newlyweds out there?
Well, don't rush into anything. I didn't get married till I was in my 30s. And so I think that I just firmly believe that when you know it's right, it's right. I don't know if there's any one piece of advice. I'd have to say, don't go to bed mad. But there's been times I've probably done that. But I think it's what's interesting with my wife Kelly and I is that we're total opposites when it comes to personalities. She's totally type A. Everything has to be lined up, and everything's got to be where it's supposed to be. And I'm a creative, kind of fluid individual. I kind of pile things up, and I know where everything is, but when you move things around, it kind of screws me up. But so she's had to learn to live with me, and I've had to learn to live with her, and we do it quite well. And we've been very blessed in our 27 years. So.
Well, that's great, Joel. Well, thank you very much for taking some time with us. If someone wanted to get a hold of you, how would they go about doing that, Joel?
Well, you can normally find me at the shop, and so you can find us online, royaltreatmentflyfishing.com. If you want to follow me on Instagram, I've got 3 different Instagram accounts because I'm trying to separate my photography and my fishing and the business, and so You can find me just as Joel Follette for my adventure stuff. I kind of do some overlanding, car camping stuff. I've got a Toyota 4Runner that's totally, I can leave tomorrow and go off for a week and still have food left over inside the truck. And then Fly Tire 27 is my fly fishing one, and then Royal Treatment fly fishing for the shop. But we try to be on social media, and although it sucks up a lot of time, I do like Instagram just because it's pretty simple. Take a picture and here you go, folks. But I would invite folks that if you come and visit the Portland metro area, come in on a Saturday and sit down, have some homemade cookies, watch the Fly Tire, make yourself at home. On the front door, when you walk into the shop, it says "Welcome home," and we mean it.
That's awesome. Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Joel.
You bet.
Thank you, Joel, and thank you for joining us on the Remote No Pressure podcast. Be sure to check out our website, remotenopressure.com, where you're going to find our Songs About Fly Fishing album, our blog, our mailing list, and also we have a awesome new sticker for our Remote No Pressure podcast listeners, perfect for that 1984 Nissan Stanza or your new Tacoma or whatever it is. Until next time, go fishing.